On April 18, 1942, just 132 days after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, Tokyo was burning. It was about 1:30 in the afternoon when the first B-25 flown by the Doolittle Tokyo Raiders dropped its first bomb. The Japanese High Command and the civilian population was caught off guard. As the raiders approached the coast of Japan, they saw smiling civilians waving at them from fishing boats, beaches, and baseball parks. They were so convinced their island home was beyond the reach of the Allied bombers, they didn't imagine that danger was imminent, even though U.S. Army Air Corps bombers were screaming overhead, just above the treetops. It was one of the most brilliantly conceived operations in aerial combat history. All 16 Mitchell B-25s found their intended targets and delivered their payloads. What the enemy did not know was the Doolittle Raiders were nearly 12 hours and 250 miles early for their rendezvous with history. The USS Hornet and the B-25s had been spotted much farther out than their planned launch distance. Early this morning, 80 Doolittle Raiders had scrambled aboard their airplanes, knowing they did not have adequate fuel capacity to reach any safe haven. It was an act of valor rarely matched in modern military history. Before it was over, a despondent Jimmy Doolittle, not knowing the location or the fate of his gallant crews, would sit atop the wreckage of his airplane and predict his own court-martial. He didn't know the raid he had led would play a pivotal role in turning the tide of events in the Pacific in favor of the Allies. That he had, in fact, just completed a mission that would change the war. I'm Gary Sinise, and this is Missions That Changed the War. "27-year-old Richard Cole was seated in the co-pilot seat of Doolittle Raider B-25 No. 1. As a young boy in Dayton, Ohio, he used to ride his bicycle to a levee above McCook Army Airfield to watch the legendary pilots of the Army Air Service test flying the leading-edge airplanes of the day. One of those pilots was James H. Doolittle. Now, Doolittle was seated inches away on Dick Cole's left as they lowered their bomber down to rooftop level in Tokyo's western suburbs. They had hit their targets and were hightailing it for a planned landing field in eastern China near Chuchao.
We flew low level till Fred Bramer recognized from photographs that they had given us on the carrier. At that time, Colonel Doolittle pulled up to 1,500 feet, and we dropped our incendiary bomb. And immediately went back down on the deck. The ACAC opened up on us, and it was pretty intense, but was not accurate. We flew maybe 100 miles south at low level, and not wanting to turn toward China and alert them of the possibility that they would recognize where we were going. And we turned on a southwest heading and flew open water, just strictly by magnetic navigation.
But they had been bucking headwinds since they had left the carrier. With the extra distance they had been forced to fly, they did not have the gas to make landfall. Then, the weather began to change. It had been severe clear over Tokyo, but now the ceiling was dropping and the wind was swirling. By the time they reached Yakushima, on Japan's western coast, visibility was down to 600 feet. The bad news was, night was falling and they were in a serious storm. The good news was, the headwind was now a 25-mile-per-hour tailwind. It just might provide enough push to get them to the China coast. Tom Griffin was the navigator in airplane number 9.
Now, according to the anticipated wind, we were going to have a headwind, which was the normal wind at that time of the year in particular, across the China Sea. And our best calculations were that after about 5 hours, we were going to run out of gas and we were going to be short of China by about 100 to 150 miles.
And there was another, bigger problem.
There was supposed to be a portable homing station there, so we could use our radio compass and arrive there, land, and gas up and fly on into western China. But the fact that we arrived when we did in the middle of that big storm, there wasn't any chance of trying to make an approach into one of the fields. The other thing is that that homing station was in an airplane that crashed on the way to get there, so it was not there. The other thing was that the Chinese, hearing our engines, thought it was the Japanese air raid, and they shut off all the electricity. So we were in limbo.
After 13 hours in the air and flying 2,250 miles, the right front fuel tank was showing empty. Doolittle told his crew to bail out. It was about 9:30 p.m.
For me, the most scared and worrisome and whatever other adjective you want to use of the whole mission was standing in the airplane looking down at that black hole, because we ejected the hatch, and outside there was a lot of wind, rain, and lightning, and you were going to have to go through that hole into a foreign country and then having any idea where you were or anything about it. To me, that was the scariest time.
After putting the B-25 on automatic pilot, Jimmy Doolittle shut both gas cocks off and left the airplane. He landed in a rice paddy in a sitting position. He was neck deep in night soil.
The Chinese had been for centuries, nurturing their crops and fertilizing their crops with what they called night soil. This is human waste and animal and human waste to fertilize their crops.
Following a cold, wet night, an elderly farmer he had met on the road took Doolittle to a local Chinese military headquarters. There were some tense moments when Doolittle refused to surrender his sidearm to the soldiers, but he eventually convinced them he was an American ally, and they began to help him. At about 9 p.m., Airplane number 7 was nearing an island off the coast at Sangchao. Pilot Ted Lawson thought he could spare the crew the risk and trauma of bailing out by effecting a controlled landing in shallow water.
Just about dark, it was raining. Finally spotted some land, and the pilot spotted a strip of beach, and he thought he could land on that beach. The engines had been running so cool all the time that it stopped at the last second when he was landing, and we had the wheel down. We hit the water with the wheel down, and it immediately turned us over. I was in the back of the airplane. The other 4 fellows were in the front. They were all thrown out to the nose. The pilot and co-pilot were still strapped to their armor-plated seats when they came to in the water. I was knocked unconscious for a little while in the back and sort of came to and could see water running in what I thought was the bottom of the airplane. Well, I finally realized the airplane was upside down, and the plexiglass on the turret had shattered, and that's where the water was coming in. So then I was able to open the escape hatch on the bottom of the airplane and crawl out there. By that time I got out of the airplane, the other 4 fellows were already up on the beach.
In one of the countless acts of Chinese heroism performed in the wake of the Doolittle Raid, the resistance leader operating in the area helped Thatcher create bamboo pallets so the injured could be transported.
We found out later that the Japanese landed 65 Jap soldiers on that spot where we crashed, came looking for us, but we had a head start on them, got across the island.
Airplane number 15 had scored a direct hit on the steelworks in the northeastern part of Kobe. It was making its way to the Chinese coast at Sanmen Bay as the weather closed in. It was nearly 9 p.m. The left engine was backfiring, and the right one was generating very little power. The pilot, Donald Smith, had decided on a water landing about 400 yards offshore. It went well. There were no injuries. In the roughly 8 minutes that the plane remained afloat, the engineer-gunner Lieutenant Thomas White scrambled to recover some critically important tools. Thomas White was not an average gunner.
Well, Dr. White was a flight surgeon, but when he found out about the raid, he asked Colonel Hilger, who was the second in command, and Doc White was about his age, the same age as Hilger, in other words, older than the normal or the average raider. And he said, "Well, I'd like to go on the raid." And Colonel Hilger said, "Well, you can't go, Doc. We've got 5 men on each airplane. We can't find another seat for you. It just wouldn't be right." So he said, if you want to be a gunner, you could maybe go as a gunner, but you're not a gunner. You're a flight surgeon." He said, "Well, I could be a gunner. Let me have a chance to try." So he went down and shot the guns and I think he came off second best in making a score compared to some of the other gunners. And so he got the job as a gunner. And so here it was a fortuitous choice to have him go on that mission, because he certainly was helpful when he got to China.
After a night in a fishing village, friendly Chinese rowed Dr. White and the rest of the crew to the island of Nandian. Again, the locals put their lives on the line, hiding the crew in a Buddhist temple while 65 Japanese soldiers swept through the area looking for them. On Nandian, Dr. White learned of the injuries suffered by David Thatcher's crew. According to Lieutenant Smith, from the moment he did, he seemed to have only one desire, which was to reach them as soon as possible.
It was the ideal providential meeting of these 2 crews with Doc White that saved one of the raiders, Ted Lawson, saved his life because Lawson was about to lose his leg, and Doc White amputated it. He gave Lawson blood from his own arms, But Doc himself, when it got too bad, that Lawson was about to go, then he gave blood from himself, which is, I imagine, a difficult thing to do.
The day began badly for the crew of airplane number 16. As they sat with propellers turning on the deck of the Hornet, a sailor on the deck crew slipped. The prop blast from airplane number 15 blew him backwards into 16's left propeller. His arm was so severely injured, it required amputation. The crew members were Lieutenant William G. Farrow, pilot, Lieutenant Robert Height, co-pilot, Lieutenant George Barr, navigator, Jacob D. DeShazer, bombardier, and Harold A. Spatz, engineer-gunner. In Nagoya, the crew found their targets, a battery of oil storage tanks and an aircraft factory. So far, George Barr wrote, all had gone well. I gave the pilot a new heading, and we started our last leg of the trip. Like the other 15 Raider B-25s, number 16 encountered the curse of the storm and the blessing of the tailwind. And like every other airplane, they experienced the sinking sensation of getting no response from Chu-Chow on 4495 kilocycles. Landfall and nightfall arrived together. Just as the fuel warning lights came on, a break in the overcast revealed the lights of a city. Navigator Barr quickly figured it was Nanchang. They were over an area believed to be in Japanese control. There was no choice now. All hands took to their parachutes. When they landed, it was nearly 1 a.m. By daylight, all 5 would be in Japanese hands. For Robert Height, George Barr, and Jacob DeShazer, it was the first day of 3.5 years of hell on Earth. Bill Farrow and Harold Spatz would never see their homeland again. The targets for airplane number 3 were industrial buildings and docks on the east side of Tokyo. Once again, the 20-cent bomb site designed by Ross Greening at Eglin Field performed flawlessly. Number 3, which was nicknamed Whiskey Pete for pilot Bob Gray's Pinto pony back in Texas, made its run for the Chinese coast. At 10 p.m., flying in thin overcast, both fuel gauges registered empty. The crew went out in the usual order: engineer, followed by the bombardier, then the navigator, and the co-pilot. The pilot left last. Jacob Manch, the co-pilot, spent a cold night in driving rain, his parachute gathered about him. For 2 days he wandered, trying to find a railroad the raiders were told operated in this part of China. On the 3rd day, tired, hungry, and scratched by thick briars, he sat waist-deep in a stream. Suddenly, the thicket parted, and a smiling Chinese man with several companions confronted him. With sound effects and hand gestures, they indicated they knew where Manch's plane had crashed. They led him to a village where he saw Chinese guerrillas carrying parts of Whiskey Pete. He found something else: the body of his crewmate, engineer Leland D. Factor of Plymouth, Iowa. Factor had either struck the plane after leaving it, experienced a parachute failure, or just hit the ground excessively hard. He appeared to have died instantly. Sadly, airplane number 6 suffered the highest casualties of the raid. Dean Hallmark, the pilot, delivered his bombs on a steel mill north of Tokyo. The airplane, nicknamed the Green Hornet, was running on fumes when the coast of China was still 10 minutes ahead of them. A water landing loomed. The navigator, Chase Nielsen, remembered it was a very hard and fast landing that left him temporarily unconscious. When Nielsen awoke, he realized he was in immediate peril. The wreckage of the plane was being pounded by surf. It was sinking fast. Though he was bleeding and his nose was broken. He climbed up through the windshield, inflating his Mae West life preserver. He joined Bob Meter, the co-pilot, on top of the submerging plane, while the crew struggled to inflate their malfunctioning life raft. William Dieter slipped off the wing. At nearly the same moment, a huge wave washed the rest of them off the now fully submerged B-25. Though they tried to maintain voice contact in the dark, each man was now left to his own fate. Chase Nielsen would later write, "I couldn't do a thing but ride the waves. I half swam and half floated for what seemed like hours. I thought about my family, the fellows back at Columbia, South Carolina who did not go on the raid, the wonderful Navy men who brought us to the launch point and were probably now being chased by the whole Japanese Navy. I wondered where the crews of the other 15 planes were, and whether Jimmy Doolittle's first combat mission might have been his last. I feared the worst might happen to Dieter and Fitzmaurice, because they seemed to be so badly hurt." Nielsen made it to shore. The next morning, from a hiding place in the stand of trees, he saw villagers and 2 Chinese soldiers looking at 2 bodies on the beach. It was William J. Dieter from Vale, Iowa, and Donald E. Fitzmaurice from Lincoln, Nebraska. The local Chinese did all they could to hide Chase Nielsen, Dean Hallmark, and Bob Meter, the surviving crew members of the Green Hornet, though the area was swarming with Japanese soldiers. After one Japanese patrol left, the 3 returned to the beach where the Chinese had hidden the bodies of Dieter and Fitzmaurice. They placed their comrades in 2 wooden boxes, chose a spot high on the beach, and buried them. The 3 officers prayed silently over the 2 enlisted men who had given their last full measure.
I bailed out and left Colonel Doolittle. He was the last one out. My chute opened properly, and looking down and to get the ripcord, I pulled the thing so hard that I gave myself a black eye. I was fortunate that my chute drifted over a pine tree, and I ended up about 12 feet off of the ground. So it was like jumping in a feather bed. It was raining very hard, and so I pulled part of the chute in and made kind of a hammock affair and spent the night in a tree. When daybreak came and I could see the ground, I had a compass and started walking west. And at dusk, I came out on a cliff, and down below I saw a little cantonment of a couple of buildings that had a Chinese nationalist flag flying up above it. And the only reason I knew it was a Chinese nationalist flag was that the same emblem was painted on the AVG P-40s that I had read about before. Anyway, I walked down there and I was accosted by a young lad, and he took me to a building that was empty except for a table. On the table was a sketch of on a piece of paper of a 2-tailed airplane with 5 parachutes coming out of it. So I finally got him to take me where he took whoever drew the sketch, which he did, and I walked into this building and it was Colonel Doolittle. He is the one who had drawn the sketch. I said, "Boy, am I glad to see you."
But Doolittle was far from happy. He recalled the days after the crash landing. When the soldiers found our plane, Paul Leonard and I went to the crash site to see what we could salvage. There is no worse sight to an aviator than to see his plane smashed to bits. This was my first combat mission. I had planned it from the beginning and had led it. I was sure it would be my last. As far as I was concerned, it was a failure and I felt there could be no future for me in uniform now. Even if we had successfully accomplished the first half of our mission, the second half had been to deliver the B-25s to our units in the China, Burma, India theater of operations. My main concern was for my men. What had happened to my crew probably happened to the others. As I sat there, Paul Leonard took my picture and then, seeing how badly I felt, tried to cheer me up. He asked, "What do you think will happen when you go home, Colonel?" I answered, "Well, I guess they'll court-martial me and send me to prison at Fort Leavenworth." Paul said, "No, sir. I'll tell you what will happen. They're going to make you a general, and they're going to give you the Congressional Medal of Honor. Colonel, I know they're going to give you another airplane, and when they do, I'd like to fly with you as your crew chief." It was then that the tears came to my eyes. It was the supreme compliment a mechanic could give a pilot. "16 B-25s left the deck of the Hornet on the Doolittle Raid. Every one of them reached Japan and bombed their targets. It was true that all the airplanes were lost. Airplane number 8, the airplane that seems to have had its carburetors either changed or reset at the Seattle Air Depot, was forced to seek the quickest landing opportunity available. It went to Vladivostok in Russia, where it was confiscated by the Soviets. The crew was interned for over a year, until the 5 men effected their own escape. As for Doolittle's men, 3 raiders died the night of the raid. Leland Factor, the engineer-gunner on airplane number 3, did not survive his bailout. William Dieter, the bombardier on airplane number 6, was too severely injured to survive the ditching of the airplane off the coast. The same was true for his crewmate Donald Fitzmaurice, the engineer-gunner on the same airplane. 8 raiders became prisoners of the Japanese. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, Lieutenant Robert Meader, and Lieutenant Chase Nielsen, all crew members of airplane number 6, were captured. The entire crew of airplane number 16, Lieutenant William G. Farrow, Lieutenant Robert L. Height, Lieutenant George Barr, Corporal Jacob Daniel DeShazer, and Sergeant Harold A. Spatz became POWs. The treatment of the prisoners was horrendous.
They interrogated us and all of that, each one individually. And there was 2 airplanes of us that had been captured. And they condemned us to death, and the Emperor reprieved us to life imprisonment. Our sentence was to be kept in solitary confinement.
I think they were very scared. They tortured them brutally. And they don't talk a lot about that in any of the books, where they put a rag over their face and they would pour water until you almost drowned and pass out, and then they would go on. Slaps, beats, socks, punches, common every day. Bamboo shoots between the joints. They would take iron rods and put them behind the break of the knee, and then they would jump on the thighs, which caused obviously a great deal of pain.
By April 24th, 6 days following the raid, all of the captured raiders had been flown to Tokyo. Their mistreatment continued unabated until August 28th, when they were made to stand trial. The trial was conducted in Japanese. The men had no idea what was being said. A record of the trial concluded that the 8 had been found guilty as charged and are hereby sentenced to death. For reasons unknown, Dean Hallmark, William Farrow, and Harold Spatz were sentenced to be executed. On October 14, 1942, Hallmark, Farrow, and Spatz were informed they were to be executed the next day. They were given paper and pencil and told they could write to their family and friends. Hallmark wrote to his father, mother, and sister. I hardly know what to say, he wrote. They just told me I am liable to execution. I can hardly believe it. I wanted to be a commercial pilot and would have been if it wasn't for this war. To his mother, he wrote, try to stand up under this and pray. Bill Farrow wrote his widowed mother, don't let this get you down. Just remember that God will make everything right, and I will see you again in the hereafter. My faith in God is complete, so I am unafraid. Harold Spatz wrote to his widower father in Lebo, Kansas, if I have inherited anything since I became of age, I will give it to you. And Dad, I want you to know that I love you and God bless you. I want you to know that I died fighting for my country like a soldier. The next day, on October 15th, 1942, the 3 Doolittle Raiders were executed by firing squad.
Those fellows were tortured, they were starved, they were put in solitary confinement, they were beaten repeatedly, and nothing they could do about it. I mean, they just lived a very tortured existence.
Each was growing steadily weaker, and Bob Meter was the weakest of the 5. Meter looked like a walking skeleton. On December 1st, 1943, the once sturdily built athletic Meter died quietly in his cell.
The Japanese were completely incensed by the Doolittle Raid. They had been concerned that such a raid might originate in China. General Claire Chennault, head of the celebrated Flying Tigers who were operating in China, recalled that the Japanese drove 200 miles into East China to seek revenge. Chennault wrote, one sizable city was razed for no other reason than the sentiment displayed by its citizens in filling up Jap bomb craters on nearby airfields. 250,000 Chinese civilians and soldiers were reportedly killed in the 3-month campaign. The Chinese had been at war with the Japanese since 1937. They knew well the brutality they employed against those who opposed them. Yet time and again, they risked all to try to help the lost American flyers get to their ultimate destination, the wartime capital of Chongqing. Their legacy is typified by a story of Tung Cheng Lu, a Chinese engineering student who was pressed into service to help Airplane No. 2 escape. At the time he risked his life for the American flyers and undertook this most hazardous of journeys. Lu had a young, pregnant wife, Man Ming Wang Lu, he was leaving behind. During our whole trip under Lu's guidance, our treatment was superb. Navigator Lieutenant Carl Widener was quoted as saying, he had risked his neck for us. After World War II ended, Lu came to the U.S. to study aeronautical engineering at the University of Minnesota. He maintained lifelong friendships with the airmen he helped in China. Lu became a U.S. citizen in 1954. 4 years later, he began work as a civilian aeronautical engineer at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, where he helped develop the C-5 military transport aircraft. Only 2 men have been named honorary Doolittle Raiders. One is Hank Miller, the naval aviator who taught the Doolittle crews how to pull a B-25 off the deck of an aircraft carrier in less than 500 feet. Tung Cheng Lu is the other. He died May 3rd, 2009. He was honored at the 2010 Doolittle Raider reunion. His children Tom, Sheridan, and Melinda Lu attended. Since 1988, Melinda Lu has been the Beijing bureau chief for Newsweek magazine.
I think it's very hard for people of our generation to understand what our parents went through and the environment that they went through. That was a very special time. My father was basically like millions of other Chinese trying to get through the war, and just happened by happenstance to be in a certain situation that propelled him to heroic actions and very unusual circumstances. And it changed his life forever.
It began as a boost for the sagging morale of a shocked and angry nation. But the Doolittle Raid turned out to be so much more.
And it looked like their next big step well might be Australia. Drive down and take over Australia. And that was just the time when we hit. And the Japanese decided they were going to put an end to that possibility in the future. And 6 weeks after our raid on Japan, they got together a huge fleet and headed across the Pacific. They had 4 carriers, they had cruisers and battleships, and they were going to take over Midway first, possibly Hawaii next. And our intelligence had broken their code, knew they were coming, and Halsey had our ship, the Hornet, and the Enterprise, the other carrier that was with us, and a third carrier, the Yorktown, and he had us sitting up north of Midway and waiting. And when the Japanese struck Midway, we flew down there, and the rest is history, what happened. Our Navy boys sunk all 4 of those carriers, and it was a tremendous victory for our side. And from that time on, if you analyze the Pacific War, instead of being on the offensive everywhere, they were back on the defensive until we were just within easy striking distance of Japan in the summer of '45.
Following the Battle of Midway, the Japanese never scored another victory in the Pacific. All 80 Doolittle Raiders received the Distinguished Flying Cross for this mission. The Chinese government decorated all of the raiders. Those imprisoned and tortured also received the Purple Heart. David Thatcher was awarded the Silver Star. Dr. Thomas White was awarded the Silver Star. James H. Doolittle was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. Every Doolittle Raider who was able to fly at the completion of the raid did so.
And so I went back overseas with the 1st Air Commando Group that made the aerial invasion of Burma later on in 1944.
I came back to Billings on Farrow for a couple of weeks, and then went to MacDill Field to Tampa, Florida, and began training in B-26s, which is a twin-engine bomber with a single tail. And then we were flying submarine patrol between Oran, Algeria, and the coast of Spain until about the middle of April 1943. Then we moved up to the front, and we were bombing the Italian and German forces until they finally chased them out of North Africa. I was on 26 bombing missions over there.
And we all got 2 weeks leave before we went to our new group. In my case, it was that B-26 group at Harding Field, Louisiana, captured. This happened in the summer of '43 on the 4th of July. Now, we had a whole big flight of B-26s, and we flew over to Sicily, and they hit us big time, and down we went. And we were on fire, so I bailed out and pulled my ripcord. A little later, when I got to the ground, I was captured immediately by the Germans down there in this field.
13 raiders would ultimately lose their lives later in World War II. In China, Jimmy Doolittle made a promise to his men.
Colonel Doolittle promised the group, he says, if we survive the mission, he says, I'm going to throw you the biggest party you've ever had after it's all over, after the war. Anyway, we had the first reunion, and everybody had a good time. It was all fun and games and so forth. And somebody said, why don't we do this again? And Jimmy said, hey, wait a minute, fellas. This cost me a pretty penny to have this party. He said, I can't afford to do it. And some of the other aviation interests sponsored and the city itself. And after that, it was kind of like Topsy. We began to receive invitations every year.
It's great to see the gang every year.
After 10 years, Mrs. Doolittle said, she put her foot down and said, from now on, the wives are going to go to these reunions. And that changed the whole tenor of our activities, yeah, I assure you. But from that time on, it was a big improvement because we couldn't have kept on the way we were.
It's not just what they did, which was extremely important for the nation at that time, but how they've lived their lives since, really. And they have put together a foundation which supports youngsters coming up in aerospace engineering. And so they continue to make contributions wherever they go, whatever communities they visit. So they are continuing as an inspiration to the next generation of airmen.
It seemed like there was a guiding hand favoring us on that whole mission, because when you analyze the whole mission, everything went our way. And we did the maximum damage that we could do against our enemy with 16 planes, each carrying a ton of bombs. We really accomplished our mission. And of course, we upset them so much that their plans brought on the big defeat of Midway later. So this little raid accomplished quite a bit in the war. After we started having these annual reunions, the city of Tucson had invited us there, and when we got there, we found that they had 80 cups, silver cups, engraved with our names on them in this case. Those who were deceased, the cups were upside down. And so for the years that went on, in all of our reunions, some cadets from the Air Force Academy brought this case of cups to our reunion, and we had a regular ceremony, drinking to those that had passed on that year, and the cups were turned over.
Gentlemen, the toast to those who are gone. When we get together, it seems like the raid was yesterday. It's great to see the ones that are still living, and we pay homage to the ones that have passed on. The mysteriousness of the thing, the way it was designed, was that in this case that holds the goblets, there was a bottle of Courvoisier that was laid down the same year Colonel Doolittle was born. As the story goes, at the end of the trail, there will be two raiders sitting together with their goblet and some of their Courvoisier in the cup. And that'll be the end of the Doolittle Raiders.
80 men. 68 years later, only 6 of them are still with us. Yet their tradition dictates that all 80 of them gather, either in body or spirit, every year on the anniversary of that heroic and historic mission. A mission that changed the war.